Mr. Speaker, the amendments proposed to the Central Provident Fund Act have several objectives, which the Minister has already explained. I will focus my comments on the clauses relating to prioritizing the recovery of subsidies following the sale of flats and those pertaining to the closure of these special accounts. While I support the bill, I have concerns over these two aspects. Clauses 28 and 29, taken together, require that owners of HDB flats that have enjoyed additional subsidies to prioritize the repayment of said subsidies from proceeds following the sale of the flat. I believe this is to accommodate the larger subsidies that are likely to be extended for plus and prime flats. The notion of repaying what one owes is, on its face, unobjectionable. That said, I believe that many of us in this House have had residents appeal for consideration of higher mortgage loans because they cannot afford the cash outlay. This could lead to a disconnect. Those selling a flat would now be required to fork out a cash amount so as to pay off the subsidies, but in doing so, they exhaust much of any cash gains that were made from the sale of the flat. Yet, they could still well face a gap between the market price of their next resale flat versus its official valuation, which would have to be made up with by cash on hand. I've had such residents in Sengkang face such a dilemma when they seek not even to upgrade, but to downgrade, and I'm certain that they are not alone. More generally, this is one of the unintended consequences of the current HDB pricing model, where a higher sticker price is de-emphasized simply because subsidies mean that the de facto price faced by buyers would be lower. But evaluations and, perhaps more importantly, mortgage loans are still based on the nominal price, and we insist on subsidies being fully repaid in cash. Then we inadvertently impose a liquidity crunch on those who wish to sell, since we strip these sellers of a significant part of the cash amounts that they would otherwise need as down payments on their next flat. At present, HDB appears to be dealing with this issue on a case-by-case basis, accepting appeals that occasionally enfold additional amounts into the HFE mortgage loan. But the basis for HDB decisions are opaque, and more importantly, I believe I have raised what amounts to a systemic issue that should merit more careful study by HDB. Now, so another key thrust of this bill, addressed by clauses 2 through 16, is to impose institutional reforms that will put an end to CPF shielding. This practice, which allows the hiving off of SA funds from being transferred into the retirement or RA, thereby accruing higher returns while also enjoying higher liquidity, had become so widespread that websites and financial institutions were openly advising on how to pursue the practice. It got to a stage where one could legitimately wonder if the government was at least tacitly endorsing this CPF hack. Now, perhaps more troubling, it appeared to have been a loophole exploited by those who were somewhat better off and financially more sophisticated. After all, ensuring that there would be sufficient excess funds in the ordinary or OA account to make up for any basic retirement sum shortfall during the transfer window would only be possible if one had larger CPF balances to begin with. This strategy would also typically be known to those who ran in more financially informed circles, or at least had a financially savvy, had access, to a savvy financial advisor. For these reasons, the Workers' Party is not opposed in principle to the closure of this loophole, given how it tended to benefit this relatively select group. However, I believe it's worthwhile making a few additional points. First, we should understand why, beyond the notion of fairness mentioned earlier, this loophole was ultimately unsustainable from a purely financial perspective. sustaining an interest-bearing SA after the age of 55 would have meant savings that combine both higher interest rates relative to the OA with comparable liquidity. Yet there's almost always an inherent trade-off between higher returns and these returns being locked into an investment for a longer duration. Now, this is fairly standard stuff in financial economics. And of course, pension managers, such as CPF, would not have been exempt from this trade-off. And the allocations to more illiquid investments is what, in part, would have allowed them to harness the higher returns necessary to meet the SA obligations. But when we promise higher returns but still allow account holders to withdraw their funds at will, we short-circuit this process, which threatens to unravel the otherwise sound long-term investments that CPF will have taken exposure in. Hence, given its inherent unsustainability, this loophole had to be closed. That said, there is at least some degree to which we need to acknowledge that closing the loophole amounts to an upending of both account holders' expectations as well as the legacy rights of those who invested in the SA prior to this bill. This is, of course, yet another reprise of the theme of retrospective lawmaking, which is something that both my honourable friend, Louis Chua, as well as I have raised in this House on prior occasions. In this instance, it is the notion that those who will now experience disruptions to their retirement planning, since they had originally planned on having SA income as part of their retirement portfolio, need not be compensated. But as mentioned earlier, there was little indication that what they were doing was either inappropriate or illegal. So, to be clear, those who invested in the SA have undeniably enjoyed the higher rates associated with locking their balance in that account in the meantime. And in fairness, it was always known that there would be a transfer of SA funds into the RA at the age of 55. Still, there's at least some who have been hurt by this change in policy. Hence, while calling for outright compensation for this group may be a step too far, it seems at least fair to acknowledge that some have been, at the very least, inadvertent victims in the government's policy shift, and to ask how they may be able to receive guidance on how to go forward. Now, perhaps more fundamentally, we should also ask the question of what drove so many to seek to squeeze higher returns in the first place. Part of this, surely, is that despite assurances by the government that the CPF rate is adequate for retirement, those that were taking advantage of this SA loophole clearly thought otherwise. That's why the Workers' Party had, in this House, previously suggested that CPF rates be raised to reflect high inflation, that it be computed with daily or monthly rates to better harvest returns, or that it also consider one-off adjustments to the OA rate, not just to deposit, but also lending rates, which tend to reflect better the global costs of capital, among others. Now, I'm hopeful that the CPF board will continue to extend options for our account holders to build up sufficient savings for retirement. One useful reform, which admittedly goes beyond the pure scope of the bill, but is consistent with its spirit, is to offer more options for higher returns. This goes beyond re-examining how we calculate the OA interest rate, as important as that may be. We should also look to expanding the universe of CPF-approved investments. At the moment, there remain a dearth of low-cost index fund options for a portfolio of either domestic or internationally diversified companies. Decades of research have shown that these are among the most appealing ways to build retirement wealth. Rather than continue to indirectly encourage the overweighting of real estate in our retirement portfolios, we should ensure that equities, which tend to offer even higher returns on average over the long run, feature prominently in our future generations' CPF savings. This could even have a secondary spillover effect, bolstering our moribund stock exchange. Sir, the purpose of this speech is, of course, not to offer this House investment advice. Rather, I hope to highlight how many Singaporeans feel that their rate of accumulation of CPF savings is less and less able to keep up with their retirement needs. Some of this has led to pathologies, such as the stretch for yield in exploiting the SA loophole. Others have tried to parlay the HDB housing ladder, but this effort runs up against the goal of keeping public housing more affordable. This is further exacerbated by how extracting cash from a housing investment may be more challenging than sometimes believed, as I explained earlier on in my speech. Further bolstering the returns available from CPF saving through ways I've described will strike at the heart of the problem that has led many to hunt for returns via either shielding or housing.